Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to the first video of my second annual BookTube birthday Q&A. My apologies for a bit of a delay, and thank you all so much for all your well wishes. Today, I finally want to address some of the wonderful questions y'all were so kind to leave me on the somewhat recent call for questions. There are a lot of questions, and I think I might have a lot of stories to tell in response, so let me get right to it. The first question, Around the Weird, asks, what's the worst book from your favorite author? And a follow-up question, have you read any books that you hated at first but loved after some time had passed? The first book I ever really hated was written by an author I much later came to love. I think I've told this story before here on this channel, but I'll tell it again here. I was 17 years old, and it was the night before a big college scholarship interview. My mother's collection of classic novels lived on the top shelves of the built-in bookcases along one wall of my childhood bedroom. And as I got older and taller, I used to pull various volumes down whenever I needed something to read. That night, I thought a slim book would be perfect to keep me calm and distracted. I pulled down Edith Wharton's Ethan Frome, an old Norton Critical edition as I remember it. I started reading and absolutely hated it. Hated the characters and their closed-off, weak meanness to each other. Well, the next day, I sat in a scholarship interview with 5 or 6 interviewers asking me all sorts of questions. One of the first, what's the best book you've read recently? I immediately launched into a rant about how I had just read the worst book I'd ever read the night before and why I hated it. When I finished, I felt like an idiot and stumbled around trying to emerge from the world of the book I had just spent 20 minutes reliving and shift to some book I loved. Why didn't I just talk about Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice or maybe Antigone? Of course, now I realize that a rant about how much I hated a particular classic book and why actually showed that I was in fact a fairly serious reader, at least as much as saying I loved a book. I got the scholarship. Still, my hatred of Ethan Frome was so visceral that it took me almost 3 decades to read any other Edith Wharton books. Now, I absolutely love The House of Mirth, especially, and Age of Innocence and Custom of the Country, but I still haven't read Ethan Frome again. I just can't bring myself to do it when there's so many amazing books still to be read surrounding it on my shelves. Around the Weird also asks an appropriately weird, but also appropriately charming question next. Who do you think would win in a fight between Nathaniel Hawthorne and Oscar Wilde? I'll vote for Oscar Wilde. He was a large man and an oversized personality, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was both petite and a bit reserved. I think that gives Wilde the advantage. Hester Dunlop says, I love to read fiction that has a strong sense of place. Of the places where you've lived, which novel or author would you recommend that does this? I grew up connected to 2 places. One was Scotland County, North Carolina, where half the names in the phone book began with M, actually with MC, McLaurin, MacDonald, etc., because so many of the families there were descendants of Scottish immigrants. We lived in a town with a small college where my father taught when I was young. Our other home was Horry County, South Carolina, right along the coast, where both my grandmothers and all my cousins lived when I was young, and where my parents grew up and returned right about the time I started high school. These 2 homes were about 2 hours apart. Even when I was young and we were living in North Carolina, we traveled between them extremely regularly to see family members and friends. The 2 places, while fairly close together, were quite different. Way back then, we knew about the cosmopolitan diversity that existed in the more urban areas in the north, with more recent immigrants from all over the world in a variety of religious backgrounds, etc., etc. But most people thought of my part of the South as a South still made up just of blacks and whites who would live there in the area for generations. But Scotland County was a little different even then. The county had one public school system and no private schools, and at that point the students in the county were roughly one-third white, one-third black, and one-third Lumbee Indian. The Lumbee tribe is a state-recognized tribe in North Carolina, centered around Scotland County, but also a couple of other surrounding counties. Soon after the U.S. Civil War, an origin story for Lumbees emerged, not exactly based on any real evidence, proposing that Lumbees were descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke, from the time when Sir Walter Raleigh tried to establish a permanent colony in what is now the U.S. The settlement was struggling, desperately in need of supplies. One of the leaders of the settlement sailed back to England to restock, although for a variety of reasons it took more than 2 years before the ship returned. And upon return, the crew found that the entire population had disappeared. Letters had been carved into the wooden fence. Croatoan or Croatan. Did it refer to a nearby island? The name of a native tribe? For hundreds of years now, it's been assumed that the original English settlers had assimilated into local native communities. At some point after the U.S. Civil War, as I said, a story started circulating that the Lumbee tribe members were the descendants of the lost colony, descendants of intermarriages between English settlers and the members of the local native communities who may have taken them in, probably also including black escaped slaves. Perhaps so, but as I said, the story is not based on clear historical evidence. There are a lot of other relatively complicated accounts of the roots of the Lumbee tribe based on more sophisticated scholarship recently, but the romanticized version was still quite popular when I was growing up. Well, back to your question about the literature of place. When I was in high school, living in South Carolina by that time, my father became friendly with the local novelist Josephine Humphreys. Most of her novels were about coastal South Carolina, where my parents both grew up and where we were living by that point. Her books, Rich in Love and Dreams of Sleep, talk about the echoes of the past that still exist along the coast of South Carolina, the general area my family had called home for generations. And then at some point, several years later, and much to my surprise, Humphreys came out with a new novel, an historical novel about the interactions of whites, mostly of Scottish descent, and Lumbees in Civil War-era North Carolina. I haven't read the novel again since it was first published in the year 2000 or so, but I loved it when I read it then. And since I recognized both of my places in her fiction, Josephine Humphreys seems like a perfect answer for your question, Hester. The next question. A viewer who would like to remain anonymous wants to know about some of my earliest memories of reading full-length books. I think my first memory is actually from the school library, although I suspect it wasn't my first long book. Every week when my first grade class went in for library day, we would choose a picture book or two from a group of books on a long table, pre-selected for us by the librarian. When I commented that I had already read all the choices that week, the librarian grinned at me, waved at the back shelves, and told me to pick out whatever I wanted. I chose the fattest book I could find, a dark blue, cloth-bound biography of Helen Keller. The book completely sucked me in, starting a long history of both loving nonfiction as well as reading books which challenged me. I checked that volume out from the library again and again, and it shaped my career. The first real novel I fell in love with was Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. From the time I was in second or third grade until I graduated from high school, I think I must have read Little Women every winter as I watched the people around me celebrating Christmas right along as the March family did in the book. When I was very young, I saw parts of me in all four of the sisters. In those early years, I was especially drawn to the first part of the novel, full of stories of the girls when they were young. When I read the novel later in my life, as a young 20-something, I was surprised how much I was drawn instead to the second part of the novel, dealing with the sisters' complex lives as the young women matured. So yes, I think those might have been two of the most important long books I read as a youngster. Sancordia asks if I've ever read anything by the author, not the actress, Elizabeth Taylor. I have not, although I think I have a copy of Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont on my shelves in one of those lovely Virago Modern Classics editions. I was very recently eyeing A Game of Hide and Seek, published as an NYRB edition, with an introduction by the contemporary novelist Caleb Crane, someone I've been following and admiring since he was writing for his college literary magazine. I assume your question is because you like Elizabeth Taylor's work. Which is your favorite, and where do you recommend I start? Sancordia asks a couple of other questions. First, what is your favorite book by an Irish author? I think I have to name the poet Seamus Heaney. His collection Fieldwork was the first book of his I really fell in love with, I think. I love his often quiet formality and the way history and a real sense of place echo through his writing. I had the great pleasure to study with Seamus Heaney when I was in college, and in fact I have a favorite personal story where he plays kind of a key role, a story I don't think I've told here in at least a year or so, and which I might sometime again soon. I promise I'll make it easy to skip over if you've already heard me tell it. But back to this question about Irish writers, I want to talk for a moment about my favorite reading experience in Ireland during a trip that my spouse David and I made with our son several years ago for him to study traditional Irish music in a tiny town in Donegal in the upper northwest of Ireland, a town with many times more sheep than humans. When Abraham was in classes and performances all day, David and I started reading James Joyce's Ulysses aloud to each other. The book was a first read for both of us. Each day, we'd individually read several different commentaries for each chapter, but come together to read Joyce's text aloud to each other afterwards. Sometimes we holed up in our tiny bed and breakfast room to avoid the rain. Other times we sat outside in the sunshine, passing the book back and forth as sheep gathered around us to listen. We had to travel home before we'd finished, and I have to admit that we still have not finished the book together, although my husband has made much more progress than I have. The next question from Sancordia asks what my favorite autobiography is. I'll name two here. The first is Barack Obama's Dreams of My Father. I think I read it the day after his electrifying speech at the Democratic National Convention back in 2004. This book feels like it belongs to a whole different genre from the kinds of memoirs and autobiographies that politicians usually write. And perhaps that's because Obama did not necessarily know that he was a politician back when he wrote it in the early or mid-1990s. It's a deep and beautifully written meditation on how Obama grew up, his own Bildungsroman in an American key. It's hard to read it now without the lens of what he has done since, I'm sure, and I'm very glad I read it before he ran for president. But I would still recommend it highly. Another memoir autobiography I loved is Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast. I read it while I was taking a weekend beach vacation with my best friend and her parents back when I was in fairly early high school. I just plucked it off the shelf of my mother's books I mentioned earlier, and I selected it pretty much at random as I remember. I knew absolutely nothing about most of the authors mentioned, or about that period in history in Paris, or anything. It opened my eyes to a whole new world. Part of me has wanted to reread it, and I almost have many different times over the years, but part of me wants to keep it special, the way it feels in my memory still. Have any of you read it recently? I'd love to hear what you think of it. Should I reread it after all these years, or will I just spoil my memories? And the last in this set of questions asks if I read much in translation. Not really. I read a surprisingly small amount of contemporary fiction of any sort actually. Most of the translations I read are either translated from ancient Greek or Latin, or 19th century or early 20th century works translated from Russian or French or Spanish, books that basically have been considered canonical for many years. The thing I enjoy most about reading these classic books in translation is that quite often there are a great number of very different translations, usually even multiple contemporary translations. I've made videos about various translations of Sappho and Homer's Odyssey, maybe Gilgamesh too. There's very little I like more than sitting on the floor at the library, pulling down every translation of a work, and spending some time comparing them. Sometimes I just want to know which one to start with, which one feels like it'll be accessible and enjoyable read. But usually I get totally wrapped up in what is different and why, and how even small differences in interpretation can shape a book in fairly significant ways. I mentioned in my Mooks and Gripes bucket list tag that I'm hoping to read War and Peace during 2022, and that I'm hoping many of you will join me and perhaps lead me through this adventure. I must say that one of the things I'm really looking forward to doing is deciding which translation to use as my main text. I think my spouse David may join in for the read-along, and I'm kind of hoping that he'll read a different translation so we can compare our notes as we go along. So yes, I do read some translated fiction, but I definitely really have some real limits or failings when it comes to this kind of work. More contemporary novels from all over the world written in various languages and translated into English, they're fairly rarely part of my reading, to be honest, by and large. And of course, that is only one of the huge gaps in my bookish knowledge. If you have some special translated favorites to recommend, I'd love to hear. I'm especially interested to hear from you if you've read a particular book in its original language and in an English translation, or if you've read two different English translations. One viewer recommended a classic Portuguese novel from the 19th century that went straight on my read fairly soon list, a list I hope to use for a second Mooks and Gripes bucket list video of classics written by people other than the 100% Dead White Men list from last time. Possibly next week, or maybe the week after that. The next question. Alan Black asks if I read much fantasy, and if so, what are some of my favorites? I'm afraid my answer here is actually pretty similar to my last answer. I really have read very little fantasy or science fiction either. I very much enjoy the kind of slightly fantastical worlds like Hogwarts of Harry Potter fame. In that case, we see kids, whom we all but recognize as the kinds of kids we know, living in a boarding school. We all but recognize, even if we don't know boarding schools, with an overlay of magic. To be honest, the scenes from Harry Potter that stick most in my memory are the ones that seem the most realistic, not the ones that seem most fantastical. I have read a bit more apocalyptic literature, the wonderful Octavia Butler series, but also a few others that I found engaging but not especially memorable. And now I have Ursula Le Guin on my list of books to read soonish. But yes, this is another of the huge holes in my reading experience. If y'all keep asking questions, you'll uncover quite a few more. Just like for the last question, chime in the comments with lists of your favorites and also books you recommend for a newbie like me. Luis Miranda Gutierrez asks a fascinating question. My question is, have you felt compelled to visit a country after reading the works of a particular author? Any examples? Thanks. The books that most make me want to visit their settings are often books from England, interestingly. I haven't been to England, well, except for its airport as I changed planes, since I was 3 years old, when my family spent months in the UK while my father collected folk music. That's a long story for another day. My husband and son traveled to London and much of the surrounding countryside a few years ago, but for a variety of reasons, I stayed home. The author whose books make me want to visit is Thomas Hardy, whose real but fictional area, let's say, seems like a place I really need to visit. I'm not sure why this feels so important to me. Perhaps because it's an English version of William Faulkner's real but fictional Yoknapatawpha County, a place that's meant a lot to me over the years. And when I'm in England visiting literary sites, I also want to visit the home region of the wonderful Swallows and Amazons, a series of books by Arthur Ransome, and the lands of the Bronte sisters, and even Bloomsbury, etc. There's definitely a part of me that thinks I should choose something far less familiar to me to answer this question, but I think the fact that I've read as much British lit as I have might be part of the reason why I feel like this is a land I ought to know by heart in some way. Have any of you gone on literary pilgrimages to places discussed in books? I'd love to hear about them. Well, I think I will stop there for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with part 2 of the Q&A answers. Thanks so much to all of you for these great questions, and also for making BookTube such a wonderful place for me over the course of these last 2 years. You've helped me appreciate the breadth of literature and the bookish life far more than I'd ever had before. BookTube's introduced me to bookish people all over the world. This is an amazing place. I'll be back soon, and I hope you will join me again for more long-winded stories here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.